Can you tell us a little bit about what you and your colleagues at IBM are currently involved with in terms of smart cities and the related energy transition?
Sure. I mean, I'll even start from the beginning and do a very quick history lesson. But around the turn of the century, so that's nearly 20 years ago, IBM started thinking about, and its employees started thinking about, what were the next investments in research going to be. And there was a very strong push by employees and executives alike that said, environment is really something we need to focus on. And for a while, we did just that. We focused on, we used some of our patents to build photovoltaic cells, thin film photovoltaic cells. We built some membranes for water desalination plants. And those were very interesting. We even built some plans for a desalination plant that would have been solar powered out in the Middle East. And that's all great. But IBM is not a photovoltaic cell manufacturer, nor in the water business, really. We're in the data business. So we started rethinking about what our involvement would be in environment and started thinking about it in terms of data. And all the major problems in environment, whether it's air pollution or greenhouse gases or water, which are three major categories of issues to deal with, tend to be, from our standpoint, data problems. We don't have enough information about the quality of those different things. We don't know where the greenhouse gases are in real time, where they're emitted from. We need to plan long-term for a transition to low-carbon energy sources, for example. But there isn't enough information or price signals, and the price signals are really important in water consumption, for example, to drive the right kind of behavior. So we pivoted essentially and started focusing on the data related to environment. And all the data related to environment is really interesting to focus at a metropolitan level or at a city level. Focusing on the environment at a national level or supranational level is very difficult because the environment's very different, between Alberta and Quebec and Florida and France. And if you try to get an overall view, it's much too complicated. If you go too small and focus on individuals and companies, you're not having much impact. But at the city level, everything related to transportation and greenhouse gases, building codes, behavior at a metropolitan level, water consumption at a watershed level for the environment, that's the appropriate scale. And that's what became smart cities. So for us, smart cities is really rooted in looking at environmental data. What we're doing these days, so recently we released a platform for managing water data at a watershed level. We're working with a number of energy providers around the world around some mobility transitions. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later today. Those are the two areas I'm really focused on. But of course, as far as smart cities goes, there are any number of smart meter projects with a number of, again, energy providers. There are lots of companies that are focused on rebuilding or digitizing their processes so they can start focusing more on the why are people using my product, my energy product, or my transportation product, and then offering a service that's tied to that. And those are a lot of the projects that we're involved with right now.
Great. I mean, I think we've seen some reticence around that data collection in the marketplace as a precursor to investment. In other words, in a lot of the sort of environmental market spaces, the answer back from the business community, the investment community, has been, show us the numbers and then we'll talk about whether an investment opportunity will be forthcoming. And so I think it's obviously forward thinking for IBM to be looking at that data first and then knowing that the markets and the opportunities will follow, as opposed to waiting for the business drivers, which ultimately come too seldom. I wonder if we can sort of talk a bit more about, just more generally, about smart cities and what is it we see in Canada around smart city development, and maybe we can contrast that perhaps with what's been happening elsewhere in the world in this space.
Yeah. Well, there have been a number of different projects in smart cities in Canada. I won't conceal the fact, I don't think Canada is the most advanced country for smart cities for a number of reasons. Most of them are good, I think. Um, and what we're seeing is, well, there are a number of cities that have launched either small pilot projects related to managing parking. We've seen a federal competition, the Smart Cities Challenge, which awarded prizes to a number of different cities to build up some of these projects. Of course, there's been the pandemic in the past couple of years, so these haven't really progressed as much as we'd like. We have seen the telcos have been involved in working with cities also on some small scale projects, some of which have to do with parking or building management of the, or fleet management of the cars that are owned by a city. So a lot of these are relatively, I will say, small scale projects. And that came after a period where there's a lot of willingness and ambition to do great things. And I think that ambition hit a wall, essentially, the wall being, well, these require investments. They require investments in technology. Those aren't necessarily areas that cities are super well equipped to deal with. When you think of technological advancement, this isn't something that cities have focused a lot on for, in the course of their history. And so for them to take on that pivot is not necessarily easy. So change didn't come maybe as quickly as we wanted. We saw a few examples of that. There's a project in Toronto that's relatively well known that also, hit a few speed bumps on the way. Again, we're still waiting to see what some of the other cities are. So I think we're going to see some evolution. We're going to see some small projects that are going to build up over time. Possibly, in a few years, we'll see advancement. But we have to understand that smart city projects and technology projects in Canada are fraught with political risk. If you invest in a project in Canada as a mayor or as an elected representative, and it doesn't work out, your face is going to be on the front page of the paper, and people will say, "Why did you waste money?" We can take a look at what's happening in Europe, for example, and Europe's been perhaps a little bit more ambition and has maintained its level of ambition. In one way, they've managed to do that is by giving control of the data around the city to a metropolitan layer. So rather than looking at Toronto's data, they're looking at GTA data. So there's an intermediate level of government there between the city and the province, which has access to quite a lot of data. Here, mobility data, for example, is shared between the city, the province, the federal government, private providers. If you want access to it, you have a lot of work ahead of you if you want to optimize transportation systems. And the responsibility for the TTC is not the same as the one for roads, is not the same as the one for highway. If you want to start putting tolls somewhere, you have to get a bunch of different people to agree. And often just the data about how many people are driving on the highway versus the road right next to it is not even shared by the same level of government. So it's very difficult to do projects in that kind of mixed governance framework. So in Europe, what they have is a little more centralized access to data around that metropolitan layer, and that's allowed them to do some experimentation. And the second part of their success was they let the private sector do the experimentation as a partnership. And so the private sector does a bit of investment with the public sector. They'll do a pilot project together. And if it works out, the public sector can say, look at the great idea I had. The mayor can claim a win. If the pilot project doesn't work out, the mayor can say, Well, that's just the private sector doing its own stuff. Didn't work out. We don't have to do anything with it, and we'll let go of it. So they're managing the political risk, and they've managed to pull in the data in one area, and that helps fix a lot of the problems related to smart cities. If you look in Asia, Asia has had quite a lot of success. And if you take a look at the smartest, or what we would call maybe the smartest cities from the standpoint of using the data, you can take a look at Singapore, any number of cities in China, in Japan. They have much more directed economies. They often will decide things as a club.
Yeah, and I think we've heard time and again around the data concerns as to whether it's anonymized or not, and what the private sector partners in a P3 would be looking for in terms of that data, and that I think that's been a hurdle, and perhaps will be a hurdle in terms of our transition to smart cities. But I wonder if we could talk a bit more about the kinds of projects. Are we seeing smart cities projects compartmentalized? In other words, um, uh, very specific sector focused as opposed to a kind of broader, even at a pilot scale, a kind of broader approach that would touch upon all of the potential uses of data? I mean, can you comment a bit about what we're seeing so far, and is it piecemeal as opposed to the kind of project that would be transformative in terms of communities?
Yes, I will say it's definitely piecemeal is what we're seeing here. I mentioned parking a lot because I think that's one of the areas where the population already has this notion that it's okay to pay for parking. It depends where, obviously, and it depends how much. But parking is one of these things where I understand, and there's always a shortage of parking. So if there's some intelligence to help optimize the amount of parking available and show people where the parking is and being able to pay for parking, then people will tend to accept that. And parking is often run not necessarily directly by the government, but by a paramunicipal organization, which may have a little more flexibility in what it does. And again, less of a political price to pay. So that's what we're seeing, especially in large cities. The distinction I'll make is that sometimes smaller cities, the ones that, have the ability or the funds to move forward, they can be a little bit more ambitious or broad. So you're seeing a lot of smaller cities creating, a central repository or a single channel for customer, or I should say citizen communication or resident communication. And so I have, a city of X ID card, and that allows me to access, the local library. That allows me to apply for permits at the city. That allows me to store documents that are related to my municipal transactions for taxes or school taxes. That allows me to get communications about what's happening with garbage collection. So all these services in a smaller city, they may have a little bit more flexibility in creating something that's a little bit broader. But at the same time, they probably don't have the critical mass to make changes that are massive. So they will probably not be able to, use mobility data to create a whole new car sharing system, for example. So their ambitions are maybe not as high, but they manage to move along in a way that's rather significant. A large city with all its data silos, with all its functional silos and the way they work, with the fiefdoms inside the bureaucracy that don't necessarily want to talk about, but all to talk to each other, but also the safeguards around making sure that private information isn't shared across services. And again, the political risk being higher. I think that's made the projects in the larger cities much more siloed.
Yeah, yeah. And let me ask you, in terms of those large city projects, I think one of the concerns we've heard on the energy side is the increased demand that additional servers, data servers, will make on the existing infrastructure. Do you have any thoughts on how that can be addressed in a way that is consistent with a locally focused economy? In other words, potential local generation, local distribution, responsive to that higher level of demand?
Yeah. Well, certainly. I mean, I think the figure we have right now for IT consumption of energy, or at least as a source of greenhouse gas emissions, is around 2 or 3% of global emissions, which puts it on par approximately with the airline industry. So a rather large amount of emissions. It's maybe not quite the same in the sense that it's possible for all this computing power to help people reduce emissions in other ways, I suppose. And a lot of the providers of large data centers and IT providers have made commitments to net zero emissions, in the next 10 years or so. So we may see some reduction that way. Certainly for the energy and utilities sector, the shift to decentralized generation and storage is very important. And even in Quebec, where I live, the price of energy is very low. I mean, domestic rates are 6 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour, depending on how much you consume. There's no time of day pricing or anything like that. Just relatively low flat rate for people to consume energy. But the new dam projects that have come online are now more expensive, or create energy that is more expensive to create than solar panels or wind. And so we're probably at the end of the large scale big energy production facilities like we've seen in the past, and hydroelectricity was one of the cheapest ones around, if you had the rivers, obviously, to do them. And so we're going to move more and more to decentralized generation, which is much more difficult for energy utilities to optimize the grid for. They can't necessarily predict what's going to happen. There's certainly going to be a shift from thinking about, well, can I manage the entire amount of energy to, can I just manage the base load and then just compensate for when there's not enough wind or solar? Can I use my dams to do that? Can I use my nuclear plants to do that? So there will be a shift. And the next shift after that, so this shift on decentralized energy has already started. Although, in some states in the US, they're actively fighting against it. It's hard enough to manage that some utilities don't want people to put solar panels on their roofs. They'd rather keep the monopoly to themselves. We'll see how that progresses over time. But certainly the next revolution after that is going to be the decentralized storage. So, if I can store enough energy in my car to power my house for a few hours, and if because of that, I can take a load off the system right at peak time, where it's really expensive for my utility to generate energy because they have to import it from somewhere, or they have to use their most inefficient plants, then maybe the utility is going to pay me to do that. So I charged my car at 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and I have it sitting in my driveway. Maybe the utility will say, well, rather than importing from a neighboring state at 45 cents a kilowatt hour, I'll buy the energy in your battery back for 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So long as you don't need to drive anywhere, you can make money on the energy you stored. And so you can, the utilities can completely rethink the way they do that. And the more we see EVs in the street, and the more they get plugged into houses, and as they then build in this bidirectional capability, which for the most part they don't have, but are starting to have, then I think we'll see a complete rethinking of the nexus between decentralized energy production, decentralized energy storage, and mobility at the same time.
Wow. And I guess that the label we sometimes hear is pro servers, right? So consumers who are also producers. I mean, that seems to be something that is increasingly being talked about. Can we talk a bit more about the sort of EV revolution? Because I think at least in this country, not a week goes by that we don't hear about another municipality, another transit authority, another fleet that is making a transition to EV, whether it's on the battery side or whether it's a hydrogen-based, a fuel cell-based electric vehicle. But that seems to be a transition that has no limits and is picking up pace even in a pandemic. I wonder, can you talk to us a bit more about what you're seeing and how that relates to a smart cities overall project?
Sure. So, yeah, it's a very good question. So, I think what we're seeing now, and because fleets are converting, the reason fleets are converting is pretty simple. Is the total cost of ownership of an electric vehicle is already below the total cost of ownership of an internal combustion engine vehicle. You buy the equivalent car, the electric car is more expensive when you buy it, but it's much less expensive in terms of energy purchase. So, the gas you're going to have to buy versus the electrons you're going to have to buy. There's less maintenance on the EV. So if you're buying fleets, especially of cars, it's less true on, large vehicles like trucks, for example. But if you're buying lots of cars and you have to manage them, it makes sense over a period of time to spend more a bit at the beginning so that you save in the long run. So that's why we're seeing that shift now. Within 2 years, it's likely that the purchase price of an electric vehicle is going to be lower than the equivalent internal combustion vehicle. And so, there's some regulatory reasons for that. There's some incentives that are lined up for that, but generally, it's because the cost of the EVs are coming down, the cost of the batteries are coming down. Manufacturers are getting used to building them. They're selling them in larger numbers, so they get economies of scale. And so, it's normal to see that transition. So within a couple of years, it won't make much sense to buy an internal combustion vehicle. It doesn't really make sense right now, but it'll make even less sense in the future. And given that governments, including the Canadian one, are going to stop the sale of internal combustion cars, within the next decade or so, if you're buying a gasoline car these days, you're going to have to sell it one day. If there's nobody around to buy it, well, then the value of that car just went down. So there will be a shift to it. So I would take it for granted that for many people will be buying cars 2, 3, 5 years from now, it will be really hard to make the justification to not buy an EV. Now, what will be interesting to see is whether those EVs and how many of them will have, bidirectional storage capability. So that's still a minority of vehicles. We're starting to see them in a few of them. And the second part is how many utilities are ready to use them. And that's where I find it bewildering that there are very few utilities that have, set up mechanisms to leverage that storage. Even in pilot projects, just to understand how they can do that. I mean, your typical grid is built to handle about twice the normal load. And part of the reason they overbuild it that way is if you have a power failure, as soon as the power comes back on, every single thing in your house turns on at the same time. You've got a huge startup curve. And so you really have to overbuild a grid in order for it to be resilient when there's an outage, so it can come back up properly. Now, if instead of everything turning back on and going straight into the grid, pulling energy from the grid, I just pulled a little bit from my car at the beginning, that would reduce the amount of investment required in the grid infrastructure. So I think the forward-thinking utilities really should be testing out pilot projects with people who have cars just to understand, how can we leverage this new resource that, individuals have paid for. It's their own car, and tell them, look, if we can use that car to lower our cost of building the grid, we'll pay you back a portion of that or a dividend on that. And I think, that will be the interesting next steps, I think, for the energy providers in the mobility market. Certainly one of them.
Wow. And in terms of building heat, are we seeing anything currently in terms of a commitment to transition. I think in the past we've heard complaints that buildings have not necessarily been as forward, constructors have not been as forward thinking, and maybe there's a bit of some siloing in terms of the construction versus the operation and the technology. But are we seeing anything on the building side that's notable in this space?
Yeah, we're seeing a few things. I think one of them obviously is capturing waste heat. From we talked about servers earlier, so capturing waste heat from these data centers and reusing it to heat. There's some university campuses that do that. University of Sherbrooke has a project where they do that, and in fact, the problem they have now is they're realizing their heating infrastructure is way too big for what they need now, because they can recapture so much of the waste heat from their servers that it's reducing their need to actually build that. So we're seeing some elements there. The other piece that was a little bit late to the party for buildings was the openness of the data around the management of those buildings. So a lot of the data management systems for buildings were proprietary systems. If you owned a number of buildings and they each had a different company, managing the data, or different products from different companies, you couldn't have an overall view. You couldn't pull in all the data from all these systems and understand, well, how can I compare building A in this city with building B in this other city? You just couldn't do that. It was, but now we're seeing platforms that allow the pulling of data, the pooling of data once you've pulled it out, and you can start comparing how your buildings are performing. You can start comparing the cost efficiency, and you can start better allocating your investment dollars to ramp up the efficiency of your different buildings and reduce your energy costs in the ones that need to. Imagine if you could do that for all the schools in a city. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of schools in large cities. Some of them are old. Some of them haven't been maintained the way they should have been. Some of them emit heat like crazy. Now, if you could get on a chart showing you per square foot, what is the consumption of energy, how many people are in there, how much investment would help you reduce that, you'd quickly see the benefits of and be able to prioritize where to invest your dollars to improve the efficiency of those buildings. That's just not something that's not there yet, but the federal government is thinking about doing it, for their buildings. Provincial governments are probably going to do the same for theirs, and I think schools and so on will want to do it there. It's been done at the campus level, so some universities have been able to do that. It's been tied to research projects, but again, that's relatively small scale. What we need to look at are the big real estate owners and managers, and make sure that they have access to data across their field, and that's something that's just appearing now.
Yeah. Well, that would be a sea change, obviously, in terms of consumption, if that becomes a priority. I think we've seen buildings on the radar in this space, in the energy transition space, and then sometimes it tends to take a back seat, perhaps, to some other items. But I wonder if I can ask you maybe a final question, and that is, what do you see as sort of a coming project, a coming development in Canada around smart cities in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years that a lot of us don't have visibility into currently?
Well, so here maybe I'll talk a little bit about autonomous transportation. So there was an announcement just today by the federal government that they're going to start funding a high frequency train line between Quebec and Toronto, I think is about what they're thinking of for the length. So Quebec, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto. And if you think of the transportation systems we have now, this wouldn't necessarily be a high-speed train. It would be a higher speed train than what we have now, which is a very slow speed train. But so it's a little bit of an improvement. That obviously won't be ready for any number of years. Now, cars are being sold right now with the promise, and we don't know when it's going to be realized, with the promise that these cars that are in our driveways right now will be able to drive themselves, within, who knows, within a year, 2 years. but let's say it's 5 years. Let's say it takes 5 years for cars to drive themselves. And in the US, there are already a few states that have given permission to Waymo and Cruise, for example, to actually charge people for autonomous taxi rides. So it's not just a pilot project or a test project. You know, there's some cities where you can order an autonomous taxi. It will pick you up and drop you off somewhere else, and you pay for it the same way you pay for it. Like it's a business. So it's a business right now. It's going to be a bigger business in a couple of years to have these autonomous vehicles. And so that's going to have an impact on how we consume mobility, whether or not we buy cars, and how we buy cars, and perhaps how we're going to, travel from Quebec City to Toronto. Now, if I have access to an autonomous car, well, first of all, maybe I don't need to buy my own car. Maybe an autonomous car is a little bit expensive. And so what I'll want to do is I'll want to get an autonomous shared car. Maybe it's an Uber, maybe it's a Flex car or a Zip car or a car to go or something like that. But I'll have access to one of those. And I say, well, I need a car to get somewhere today. It will show up at my front door in 5 minutes because it'll drive itself there. And then it will take me to wherever I need to go. So I don't need to buy a car anymore. That also means I don't need a parking spot of my own anymore. So maybe there's room for more green space, which makes the city a little more resilient to climate change. Maybe it makes room for more parks, more sidewalks, more bike lanes. But certainly every car in a city takes up 10 parking spots. So if I reduce the number of cars by half, I reduce 5 times the amount of space that's required for those cars. That's enormous. And so cities should start thinking about how do they develop these large parking areas? How do they reclaim some of the parts of their infrastructure that are used by cars right now? And in order to do that, in order to leverage that and gain the benefit, because there's a clear benefit for cities to do that, that space will be much better used more profitably for the city and for individuals than being empty for waiting for a car. In order to do that, they have to prepare themselves to host these autonomous vehicles. And that's something that most cities haven't thought about. And it's important to think about it, and it's important to prepare for it, because what we don't want is for each individual household to own its own autonomous car. That will just not solve the problem. It just means there are just as many cars. And in fact, maybe we've made the problem worse, because now I'll drive my car to work and I'll send it home in the morning and have it pick me up from work in the afternoon and go somewhere else. I've just doubled the number of cars on the road if I do that, because there'll be lots of empty cars driving around. So we need to get people prepared to using autonomous vehicles that are shared in a fleet, shared as in a small bus or a shuttle to go small distances, maybe to go in a suburban area to the main transit hub in the area. So you don't need an individual car if you live in a suburb. We have to get those projects off the ground now, because if we don't get people used to sharing autonomous vehicles, they will buy their own individual autonomous vehicles, and we're not going to solve the mobility issue. And that's going to have a trickle-down impact on greenhouse gas emissions and the rest. So if I were to ask people to focus on one thing, is to really think about that, the intersection, the nexus between autonomous vehicles, shared vehicles, EVs, and think about, as a city, how do you make sure that this is working for you and not against you?
Yeah. Wow, that's a big question based on where we are today, perhaps. But this is part of the transition. I think it's fair to say, Jean-Francois. I mean, it's there's a lot of big issues to tackle, and I think we've seen our government, federally, provincially, across the country, at least saying the right things in these spaces. Whether the dollars are there and the political will is there, as you described earlier, that can be fleeting. But I think it's certainly an excellent time to be talking about EV transition, autonomous driving transitions, and what that means for cities.
Absolutely.
So with that, I think we'll thank you very much for your time, your insights, and best wishes to you and the IBM family.